The morning sun painted golden streaks across the warm leather booth of Mike's Diner, a modest establishment just outside San Diego that had been serving the local community for over 3 decades. The aroma of fresh coffee and sizzling bacon filled the air as the breakfast rush began to wind down. In his usual corner spot, a former Navy SEAL sat quietly, his weathered hands wrapped around a steaming cup of black coffee. At first glance, you wouldn't know he was anything special. His simple blue jacket and jeans didn't draw attention, and his quiet demeanor made him blend in with the other regular customers. But there was something in the way he carried himself, a certain steadiness in his movements, a watchful awareness in his eyes that spoke of years of training and experience. The titanium rod in his left leg was a souvenir from his final mission, though you'd hardly notice unless you knew what to look for. 15 years of distinguished service had left their mark, not just physically, but in the way he took in every detail of his surroundings without seeming to look at all. It was second nature now, just like the way he always chose the corner seat with a clear view of both the entrance and the kitchen door. "More coffee, hon?" called out Betty, the diner's longest-serving waitress. Her silver hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and she'd been working there long enough to know all the regular stories. She had a special soft spot for this particular customer, who always treated her with genuine respect and never failed to ask about her grandchildren. "Thanks, Betty," he smiled warmly, sliding his cup toward her. "How's little Tommy doing with his baseball?" Betty's face lit up as she topped off his coffee. "Would you believe he hit his first home run yesterday? I wish you could have seen it. That boy was floating on air all evening." She paused, balancing the coffee pot on her hip. "You know, you should come watch one of his games sometime. The team could use some good luck." The corner of his mouth turned up in a gentle smile. "Maybe I will, Betty. Maybe I will." The peaceful morning routine was something he had come to treasure after years of high-stakes missions and constant alertness. The diner, with its checkered floor tiles and slightly crooked photos of local sports teams on the walls, had become his sanctuary. Here, he could just be another customer enjoying his breakfast, not a decorated veteran or a former elite warrior. Through the large window beside him, he watched the usual morning crowd go about their business. The high school teacher in her sensible sit-in, probably running late again. The construction workers in their dusty pickup truck, grabbing coffee before heading to their site. The retired couple who walked their golden retriever past the diner every morning at exactly 8:45. There was comfort in these ordinary moments in being part of this simple, everyday scene. His thoughts drifted to his journey from military life to civilian world. The transition hadn't been easy. It never was for someone who had spent their entire adult life in service. The nightmares still came sometimes, and certain sounds could still trigger that instant combat readiness. But he had found his way, step by step, day by day. The diner had played a bigger part in that healing than anyone might guess. When he first started coming here, fresh out of rehabilitation for his leg injury, he could barely walk without wincing. Betty had noticed his struggle and started bringing his coffee to the table before he even had to ask, saving him the extra trips to the counter. The owner, Mike, an old Vietnam vet himself, would sometimes sit with him during the quiet hours and share stories that helped him feel less alone in his experiences. Now, 3 years into civilian life, he had built a new kind of normal. He ran a small security consulting business, using his experience to help local businesses improve their safety protocols. It wasn't the adrenaline-fueled life of a SEAL, but it gave him purpose, and that was what mattered most. The morning news played quietly on the old TV mounted in the corner. He half listened to the weather forecast as he finished his breakfast: eggs over easy, wheat toast, and a side of fruit that Betty always added on the house, claiming he needed to be more than just protein. The peaceful atmosphere of the diner wrapped around him like a comfortable blanket. The clink of coffee cups, the muffled conversations of other customers, the sizzle from the grill, all these ordinary sounds had become precious to him. They were reminders that he had made it home, that he had found his place in this quieter world. Looking down at his watch, he noticed it was almost time for his first client meeting of the day. As he prepared to leave, he couldn't help but appreciate how far he'd come from those first difficult days of civilian life. The diner had become more than just a place to eat. It was where he had slowly learned to be a regular person again, where he had found a different kind of family among the staff and regular customers who knew nothing of his military background but accepted him just the same. Little did he know that this ordinary morning was about to take an extraordinary turn, one that would remind him that sometimes the skills of his past life were still needed in this peaceful present. The peaceful morning atmosphere shattered as the growl of motorcycle engines filled the air. Not the usual rumble of commuters on their way to work. This was different. These engines were being revved aggressively, deliberately, like lions announcing their presence to the pride. The sound grew louder until it peaked in a thunderous roar that rattled the diner's windows. Betty paused mid-pour at the counter, coffee pot hovering over a customer's cup. Even the sizzling from the kitchen seemed to quiet down as three massive motorcycles pulled into the parking lot, their chrome fixtures gleaming in the morning sun. The bikes were custom-made machines, clearly built for show as much as speed, with elaborate paintwork that caught the light. The former SEAL didn't turn to look, but his reflection in the window showed him everything he needed to see. Three riders, all in matching leather vests, decorated with a local motorcycle club's insignia. A snarling wolf's head surrounded by chains. He took another sip of his coffee, his movements unhurried and calm, even as he noted how the other customers seemed to shrink in their seats. The diner's bell chimed as the door swung open. Heavy boots thudded against the checkered floor, and the smell of leather and exhaust fumes cut through the homey aroma of coffee and bacon. The lead rider was a mountain of a man, easily 6'4", with a gray-streaked beard and arms covered in faded tattoos. His two companions were younger but just as imposing, one with a shaved head and the other sporting a bandana. "Well, well," the leader's voice boomed through the diner. "Looks like we found ourselves a nice quiet spot for breakfast." His eyes scanned the room before landing on the corner booth. A smirk spread across his face as he nudged his companions, jerking his head toward the sole black customer in the establishment. The former SEAL could feel the shift in the atmosphere. The regular customers seemed to be holding their breath, and poor Betty had retreated behind the counter, her usual cheerful expression replaced with worry. He kept his focus on his coffee, counting silently in his head, a technique he'd learned years ago to maintain composure in tense situations. The bikers made their way through the diner, deliberately taking the long route around other tables to reach his corner. Their boots scraped against the floor with each step, a sound that seemed to grow louder in the unnatural quiet that had fallen over the restaurant. The leader stopped directly beside the booth, close enough that his leather vest brushed against the table's edge. "Ain't this a nice setup you got here?" the leader drawled, his voice dripping with mock friendliness. "Prime spot, good view. Must be nice getting all that special treatment." He leaned closer, one hand resting on the table. "Being a, what was it they called it? Differently abled person and all." The former SEAL took another slow sip of his coffee, his movements deliberate and controlled. He could feel the eyes of every person in the diner on him, could sense their fear and discomfort. But 15 years of special operations had taught him that the most dangerous moments required the clearest heads. "The coffee's good here," he replied evenly, his voice carrying just enough to be heard clearly throughout the now silent diner. "Plenty of empty tables if you gentlemen are looking to have breakfast." The younger biker with the bandana snorted. "Did you hear that, boss? He's giving us dining suggestions." He moved closer, his shadow falling across the table. "Maybe we like this spot best. Maybe you should find somewhere else to sit." The tension in the diner ratcheted up another notch. From the corner of his eye, the former SEAL could see Mike, the owner, reaching for the phone behind the counter. He gave a slight shake of his head. No need for outside intervention just yet. The leader moved even closer, his massive frame now blocking most of the morning light from the window. "You know what I think?" he said, his voice dropping lower. "I think some folks forget their place these days. Think they can just sit anywhere they want, take up space that doesn't belong to them." The former SEAL finally looked up, meeting the biker's gaze directly. His eyes, sharp and clear, held none of the fear the bikers were obviously hoping to see. Instead, there was something else there, a steadiness that came from facing far worse situations than three wannabe tough guys in a diner. "Sir," he said, his voice remaining calm but taking on an edge that made the younger bikers shift uncomfortably, "I've been coming to this diner for 3 years now. Betty here makes the best coffee in San Diego County, and Mike's pancakes are worth writing home about." I'd hate to see anything disturb their business. The leader's face darkened at the lack of intimidation in the response. His hand tightened on the table's edge, knuckles whitening beneath the faded tattoos. The morning sun caught the service ring on his finger, military, by the look of it, though the former seal couldn't make out the branch. What had started as a peaceful morning was balancing on a knife's edge. The regular customers watched with a mixture of concern and curiosity, while Betty hovered anxiously near the phone where Mike stood. The only sound was the quiet hum of the ceiling fans and the muffled sizzle from the kitchen grill. The stage was set for what would happen next, though none of the bikers could have guessed just how badly they had misjudged their chosen target. Time seemed to slow down in the diner as the tension reached its peak. The former CL remained seated, his posture relaxed but alert, like a coiled spring waiting to be released. Years of training had taught him that the most dangerous moments often came right before someone made their first mistake. He watched as the lead biker's frustration grew with each passing second of his calm defiance. "You think you're pretty tough, don't you?" The leader growled, his patience wearing thin. Sitting there, acting all cool and collected. He leaned in closer, his breath smelling of stale cigarettes. "Let's see how tough you are when you have to walk out of here." The other customers in the diner had gone completely still. A young couple near the door quietly gathered their things, leaving money on their table as they prepared for a quick exit. The cook had stopped working, and the only sound from the kitchen was the quiet hiss of the grill. Betty, who had watched this man come into her diner every morning for 3 years, who had seen him struggle with his injury in those early days, couldn't stay quiet any longer. "Now listen here," she started, her voice shaking but determined. "We don't want any trouble in this establishment." The biker with the bandana turned toward her, his face twisted in a sneer. "Stay out of this, Grandma. This ain't your business." Actually, the former SEAL spoke up, his voice carrying a quiet authority that made everyone in the room pause. "It is her business. This is her workplace, these are her customers, and you're disturbing their morning." He took another sip of his coffee, the movement deliberately slow and controlled. "I'm going to ask you one more time, respectfully, to find another table or another diner." The leader's face reddened with anger. "You don't tell us what to do," he snarled, and made the mistake they'd been building toward. He reached out to grab the former SEAL's shoulder. What happened next was so smooth, so precisely executed, that some of the customers would later swear they must have blinked and missed something. The former SEAL's hand moved like lightning, catching the biker's wrist in a grip that made the larger man's eyes widen in surprise. At the same time, he rose from his seat with a fluid grace that belied his injury. "I wouldn't," he said quietly, his voice low enough that only the bikers could hear him clearly. The pressure he applied was expert, just enough to make a point, not enough to cause real damage. The leader tried to pull back, but found himself held firmly in place. The other 2 bikers started to move forward, but froze when their leader raised his free hand, stopping them. Something had changed in his expression, a flicker of recognition, perhaps, or a sudden realization that they had severely underestimated their target. "That's some grip you've got there," the leader said, his voice carrying a new note of caution. "Almost reminds me of—" He paused, his eyes falling to the jacket the former SEAL wore, really seeing it for the first time. There, partially hidden by the way he'd been sitting, was a patch that made the blood drain from the biker's face. The former SEAL released his grip but maintained his stance. 15 years, he said calmly, special operations. I've had plenty of practice with people who like to grab first and think later." His eyes met the leader's with unwavering steadiness. "Now, we can either continue this discussion, or you gentlemen can take my earlier suggestion about finding another table." The younger bikers looked uncertainly at their leader, whose demeanor had changed completely. The arrogance was gone, replaced by something that looked almost like embarrassment. He rubbed his wrist, not from pain, but from the sobering realization of who they'd been trying to intimidate. "Special operations," the leader repeated softly, then let out a long breath. "Well, that sure explains a few things." He took a step back, creating space between them. "Listen, I think we might have gotten off on the wrong foot here." The atmosphere in the diner began to shift. The tension wasn't gone, but it had transformed into something different. The other customers watched in fascination as the dynamic between the men changed before their eyes. Betty, still hovering nearby, slowly lowered the phone she'd been clutching. "You could say that," the former SEAL replied, his voice level but not unkind. He remained standing, his presence somehow filling the space without being threatening. But the day's still young. Plenty of time to make better choices. The leader nodded slowly, a mix of emotions playing across his weathered face. Recognition, respect, and something else. A shadow of shared understanding that spoke of experiences beyond this moment in a small diner on an ordinary morning. The confrontation had reached its turning point, though not in the way anyone had expected when those motorcycles first roared into the parking lot. The next few moments would prove that sometimes the most powerful victories come not from physical force, but from the revelation of truth and the opportunity for redemption. The revelation hung in the air like morning mist, changing everything it touched. The lead biker took another step back, his entire demeanor transformed. He looked down at his own leather vest, then back at the former SEAL's jacket, focusing on the patches he'd somehow missed in his earlier arrogance. "I should have looked closer," he said, his voice carrying a new tone of respect. "That's the SEAL Trident, isn't it? I served 2 Marines, 2 tours in Afghanistan." He shook his head slowly. "Man, I really stepped in it this time." The former SEAL's stance remained ready but relaxed, his eyes taking in every detail of the situation. The other customers in the diner watched in fascination as the scene before them shifted from confrontation to something entirely unexpected. "You know," the former SEAL said, his voice carrying just a hint of wry amusement, "usually when people find out about the SEALs, they're a lot more interested in asking questions than starting trouble." He gestured to the empty chairs at his table. "Why don't you gentlemen sit down? Betty makes a mean cup of coffee." The younger bikers looked uncertainly at their leader, clearly struggling to process this sudden change in the situation. The bold one whispered something to his bandana-wearing friend, who just shrugged in response. Betty, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, was already approaching with fresh coffee cups and a pot of her signature brew. Her hands still trembled slightly, but her warm smile was returning. She'd seen enough veterans come through her diner to know that sometimes the strongest bonds were formed in the strangest moments. The lead biker ran a hand through his gray-streaked beard, embarrassment clearly visible on his face. "I don't know if we deserve that kind of hospitality after how we just acted." He turned to Betty. "Ma'am, I apologize for how we spoke to you earlier. That was completely out of line." "Well," Betty replied, setting down the cups with a gentle clink, "in my experience, the best way to make things right is to start with a fresh cup of coffee and some honest conversation." She filled the cups with practiced efficiency. "And maybe some of my apple pie to go with it." The former SEAL gestured to the seats again, and this time, the bikers accepted the invitation. The leader sat down first, removing his leather gloves and placing them on the table. His weathered hands wrapped around the coffee cup as if seeking warmth. 20 years ago," he began, his voice quieter now, "I was where you are. Coming back, trying to fit into a world that felt too quiet, too normal." He looked up at the former SEAL. "But that's no excuse for what we did here today. We judged you without knowing you, and that's exactly the kind of thing we all fought against, isn't it?" The diner's regular morning sounds began to return, the sizzle of the grill, the gentle hum of conversations resuming at other tables, the clink of plates and cups. The tension that had filled the air just minutes ago was dissolving into something else, something that felt almost like understanding. "Combat changes you," the former SEAL responded, taking a sip of his coffee. "Coming back, finding your place again, it's not something they prepare you for in training. Some days are harder than others." He glanced at the leader's service ring. "Which battalion were you with?" As the leader answered, the younger bikers began to relax, their aggressive postures melting away. The one with the bandana leaned forward, curiosity replacing his earlier hostility. "Is it true what they say about SEAL training? About Hell Week?" A small smile crossed the former SEAL's face. "Parts of it are exactly as bad as you've heard. Other parts." He shook his head. "Those are worse." Betty returned with slices of her famous apple pie, setting them down with maternal care. "On the house today, gentlemen," she said firmly, giving them all a look that brooked no argument. "It's not every day we get to witness something like this." The morning sun continued to stream through the diner's windows, but now it illuminated a very different scene than it had just minutes before. Where there had been tension and threat, there was now the beginning of understanding. The former SEAL and the biker leader began sharing stories of their service days, finding common ground in experiences that civilians could never fully understand. Other customers in the diner had relaxed completely, some even smiling as they watched the unexpected turn of events unfold. Mike, the owner, had come out from behind the counter and was standing nearby, nodding in approval at the transformation he was witnessing. The younger bikers listened intently as their leader and the former SEAL talked, their earlier bravado replaced by genuine respect. They began to see the man they had tried to intimidate in a new light, not as a target, but as someone who had walked a harder road than they could imagine. This was the power of recognition, of seeing past surface judgments to the shared experiences that connect people. In that small diner, on what had started as an ordinary morning, something extraordinary was taking place, the building of a bridge between people who, just moments ago, had been on the brink of conflict. As the morning sun climbed higher in the sky, the atmosphere in the diner had transformed completely. The former SEAL and the biker leader were deep in conversation, their coffee cups repeatedly refilled by a smiling Betty who couldn't help but feel proud of how things had turned around. "That's the thing about war," the biker leader was saying, his rough voice softened by memory. "You never know who's going to have your back until you're in the thick of it. Had this guy in my unit, couldn't stand him during training. Different background, different everything. But when things got bad in Kandahar, he shook his head. He risked his life to pull me out of a bad situation, never judged a book by its cover after that." The former SEAL nodded, understanding written across his face. "Sometimes the strongest bonds come from the most unexpected places," he replied, glancing at his leg. "The man who helped carry me to safety after I got this injury, we'd never met before that day. Different unit, different branch entirely. But he didn't hesitate." The younger bikers had been quiet, absorbing everything. The one with the bandana finally spoke up, his earlier aggression replaced by genuine curiosity. "How do you do it?" he asked. "Coming back to normal life after everything you've seen?" The former SEAL considered the question, stirring his coffee thoughtfully. "You know, that might be the toughest mission of all," he said with a slight smile. "No training manual for that one. Some days are harder than others. But places like this," he gestured around the diner, "people like Betty and Mike, they help more than they know." Betty, who was wiping down a nearby table, pretended not to hear, but her eyes glistened with pride. The regular customers, who had witnessed the entire transformation, were now going about their business as usual, though many were still stealing glances at the unlikely group in the corner booth. "I get that," the bold biker spoke up for the first time. "After my dad came back from Vietnam, he said the local diner saved his life. Not the food, though that helped, but having a place where he could just be normal again. Where nobody expected anything from him except to decide what he wanted for breakfast." The lead biker reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a worn photograph. "Look at this," he said, sliding it across the table. The picture showed a group of Marines, dusty and tired but smiling, standing in front of a helicopter. "That's my unit. Guy on the left there." He pointed to a black Marine with a wide grin. "Best friend I ever had. Lost touch after we got back. Sometimes I wonder if that's why He trailed off, the weight of his earlier actions hanging in the air. The former SEAL studied the photograph carefully before handing it back. "War shows us the truth about people," he said quietly. "But sometimes we forget those lessons when we come home. Start seeing differences instead of similarities again." Mike had made his way over to their table, coffee pot in hand. "You know," he said, topping off their cups, "I've owned this place for 20 years. Seen all kinds of people come through those doors. But this," he gestured at their table, "this is what it's all about. Breaking down walls, finding common ground." The morning crowd had started to thin out, replaced by the first early lunch customers. Sunlight streamed through the windows, catching the steam rising from their fresh coffee. The rumble of passing traffic and the quiet chatter of other diners created a peaceful backdrop to their conversation. "I've got something to confess," the lead biker said, his voice heavy with emotion. "Our club, we haven't always been the best neighbors. Sometimes we let our attitudes get the better of us. But seeing how wrong we were today," he looked around the table, "maybe it's time we started being part of the solution instead of the problem." The former SEAL leaned forward slightly. "You know what we used to say in the teams? Yesterday's choices are today's lessons, but tomorrow's still unwritten. It's never too late to change course. The younger bikers exchanged glances, something new flickering in their eyes: respect, understanding, and maybe a touch of hope. The bandana-wearing one spoke up again. Our club does this toy drive every Christmas. It's not much, but maybe we could do more. Reach out to the VA, matey. Now that, the former SEAL said with a genuine smile, sounds like a mission worth taking on. Betty appeared again, this time with fresh slices of pie. You boys keep talking, she said warmly. Sometimes the best plans are made over pie and coffee. The morning that had started with tension and prejudice was transforming into something none of them could have expected. A moment of genuine connection, understanding, and the possibility of real change. In that corner booth of a simple diner, barriers were coming down and bridges were being built, one story, one shared memory at a time. The lunch crowd was starting to filter into the diner, but nobody at the corner booth seemed to notice the time passing. The conversation had taken on a life of its own, moving from shared military experiences to discussions about the challenges veterans faced in their community. You know what gets me? The bald biker said, pushing his empty pie plate aside. There's this older vet who lives in my neighborhood. Served in Desert Storm. Guy can barely make it to the grocery store, but he's too proud to ask for help. Keeps to himself mostly. The former SEAL nodded thoughtfully. There are a lot of guys like that. Pride's a double-edged sword in our community. We're trained to be self-reliant, but sometimes that makes it harder to reach out when we need help. The lead biker straightened in his seat, a new energy in his movements. That's what I'm talking about. Our club's got 30 members, most of them veterans or family of vets. We've got the manpower, the resources. We've just been using them the wrong way. Sometimes the toughest part is knowing where to start, the former SEAL replied, his experience evident in his words. When I first started my security consulting business, I made it a point to hire veterans whenever possible. But finding them, reaching them, that was the challenge. Betty, who had been listening while cleaning nearby tables, couldn't help but join in. You know, I hear things in here. Lots of veterans come through these doors. Some of them just need a friendly ear, but others. She paused, considering her words. Well, some of them could use more than just coffee and conversation. The biker with the bandana leaned forward, his earlier hostility completely forgotten. What if we started right here? He suggested. This diner's like a gathering point already. We could put up a bulletin board, maybe. Connect people who need help with people who can give it. Mike, who had been hovering nearby, jumped in. I've got that empty wall space right by the entrance. Been meaning to do something with it for years. His eyes lit up with enthusiasm. Could put up information about VA services, local support groups, job opportunities. The former SEAL studied the wall Mike pointed to, his tactical mind already working on the logistics. It would need to be organized, maintained, updated regularly. Can't give people outdated information when they're looking for help. Our club could handle that, the lead biker offered quickly. We meet every Sunday anyway. Could make this part of our regular routine. Check the board, update the information, follow up on any requests for help. The younger bikers were nodding eagerly, their faces animated with purpose. The one with the bandana pulled out his phone. We've got members who are electricians, plumbers, mechanics, skills that could really help some of these vets who are struggling. And it's not just about practical help, the former SEAL added. Sometimes people just need to know they're not alone, that someone understands what they're going through. Betty returned with fresh coffee, but this time she pulled up a chair. You know what else we could do? My church has that big kitchen that's only used on Sundays. We could organize weekly dinners. Give people a chance to connect, share stories, maybe even bring their families. The energy around the table was electric now, ideas flowing freely. The lead biker pulled out a small notebook from his vest pocket and started jotting things down. Weekly dinners, maintenance help, job networking. We could make a real difference here. The key is sustainability, the former SEAL cautioned. Start small, build strong foundations. Better to do a few things well than try to tackle everything at once and burn out. Mike nodded in agreement. Rome wasn't built in a day. But look at what's happened here this morning. A few hours ago, you fellas were about to tear my place apart. Now you're planning to help build up our community. The lead biker had the grace to look embarrassed. "About that, we owe you all an apology, especially you," he said, turning to the former SEAL. "We came in here looking for trouble and found a purpose instead." "That's how change happens sometimes," the former SEAL replied with a slight smile. "Not always the way we expect, but maybe exactly the way we need." The diner had filled up with the lunch rush, the buzz of conversations and clinking plates creating a lively backdrop to their planning session. Regular customers who had witnessed the morning's confrontation now watched in amazement as the same group worked together, sharing ideas and sketching out plans on diner napkins. "You know what this reminds me of?" the former SEAL said, looking around at the group. "Mission planning. Different skills, different backgrounds, but everyone focused on the same objective." The lead biker laughed, a genuine sound that carried across the diner. "Never thought I'd be conducting mission planning in a diner with a Navy SEAL. Life's got a funny way of working out sometimes." What had started as a tense confrontation was transforming into something much bigger than any of them had imagined, the beginning of a movement that would ripple through their community, touching lives and breaking down barriers, one small act of kindness at a time. 6 months had passed since that transformative morning in the diner. The autumn sun painted the parking lot in warm golden hues as motorcycles began pulling in, not 3 this time, but closer to 20. Their chrome fixtures gleamed as they lined up neatly, a far cry from the aggressive display of that fateful day. Inside, the diner had undergone subtle but significant changes. The once empty wall near the entrance now hosted a carefully maintained bulletin board covered with flyers, job postings, and contact information for veteran services. A hand-painted sign above it read, "Veterans supporting veterans. No one walks alone." The former SEAL sat at his usual corner booth, but he wasn't alone anymore. The table had been expanded, and around it sat veterans of different ages, branches, and backgrounds. The lead biker, now a regular fixture at these morning meetings, was reviewing the week's assistance requests from their growing network. "Got 3 calls this week," he said, checking his notebook. "One vet needs help fixing his roof before winter hits. Another's looking for work, has experience in logistics. And there's an older Vietnam vet who just needs regular visits, someone to talk to." Betty moved between the tables with her coffee pot, but her role had evolved too. She'd become something of an unofficial coordinator, keeping track of who needed help and who was offering it. The diner had transformed into more than just a restaurant. It was now a hub of community support. "The roof repairs already covered," the bold biker chimed in. "2 of our guys are licensed contractors. They're heading over there this weekend." He grinned. "Might need some extra hands, though." "Count me in," the former SEAL offered. "My security business is doing well enough now that I can take weekends off. Besides, I've learned more about home repair in the last 6 months than I did in 15 years of service." The weekly veterans dinners at the local church had grown from a handful of people to over 50 regular attendees. Families came too, creating a support network that extended beyond the veterans themselves. The biker club members, who once intimidated local residents, were now known for their community service and outreach programs. "Remember that older vet from my neighborhood?" the bold biker asked. "The proud one who wouldn't ask for help. Found him at the dinner last week, sharing stories with some younger vets. Even offered to teach a mechanics workshop for anyone interested." Mike emerged from the kitchen carrying a tray of fresh muffins, a new recipe he'd been perfecting for their meetings. "You know what gets me," he said, setting down the tray. 6 months ago, I was reaching for the phone to call the police. Now look at this place." The diner had become something of a legend in the veteran community. Word had spread about how a potential fight had turned into a movement of support and understanding. Veterans from neighboring towns started showing up, first out of curiosity, then becoming regular participants in their initiatives. "The best part," the bandana-wearing biker said, "is seeing the change in some of our own club members. That tough guy act was just that, an act. Turns out helping others is a better way to feel strong." The former SEAL nodded in agreement. "That's something they don't teach you in training. Real strength isn't about intimidation or violence, it's about lifting others up when they're down." Through the diner's windows, they could see more bikes arriving, along with cars and trucks. Today was special. They were organizing their first job fair specifically for veterans. Local businesses, many owned by veterans themselves, were coming to offer opportunities to their fellow service members. "You know what's funny?" Betty said, refilling their cups. "That morning, I was terrified something terrible was going to happen. Instead, it was the beginning of something wonderful." She gestured toward the packed parking lot. "Look at all these people coming together." The lead biker stood up, his weathered face softening with emotion. "I've been thinking about that day a lot," he said. "How close we came to making a terrible mistake. But sometimes it takes standing on the edge of something bad to see the path to something good." The former SEAL rose as well, ready to help set up for the job fair. His legs still carried the titanium rod, but these days he moved with renewed purpose. In the SEALs, we had a saying, "The only easy day was yesterday." But looking at what we've built here, I'd say some days are pretty good, not because they're easy, but because they're worth it. As they began preparing the diner for the incoming crowd, the morning sun streamed through the windows, illuminating the scene. The bulletin board wall was now flanked by photos, pictures of roof repairs, yard cleanups, community dinners, and groups of veterans working together. Each image told a story of barriers broken down, bridges built, and lives changed. The diner had become more than just a meeting place. It was a testament to how a moment of potential conflict could transform into a movement of compassion and support. The story of that morning, when bikers harassed a disabled veteran only to discover he was a Navy SEAL, had become part of local legend. But the real story wasn't about confrontation or regret. It was about the power of understanding, the strength of community, and the endless possibilities that open up when people choose to see beyond their differences and find their common ground.